No, I should have had it at the ready. Woo. How dare you not have everything I need at a moment's notice?
Fire him.
The job is not hard. You
You just have to know everything and be everywhere. I don't
Sounds like a
understand
city
what
clerk.
Yeah.
Welcome to the Georgia Politics Podcast. This is Preston Thompson. It is March 22nd, 2019. We have a bit of a transportation special for everybody today. Quick note at the top, while we are recording right now, the Senate debate over House Bill 481 is happening. There is a large crowd down at the Capitol. I found it a little disingenuous to talk about it while the debate was going on, so we're gonna let that sit and come back to it at a later time when we've got more information. But wanted to let everybody know that that's how the timing worked out if you're wondering where that issue is today.
We're not avoiding it.
We are not avoiding it. No, we don't do that here. So what we are going to talk about is this past Tuesday, Gwinnett County rejected MARTA expansion to Gwinnett County for the third time in its history. A 54% no, 46% yes. I think a lot of people were surprised at the distance about that. We're going to get some reactions from our panelists. First, let's go around and introduce ourselves. To my right, filming on the phone for the live stream right now.
Oh, you're going counterclockwise?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm Hans Appen, Appen Media Group, Appen Podcast Network.
And then at the corner of the table, checking his March Madness
Filling
bracket.
his bracket.
This is Craig Kidd, first vice chairman of the Fulton GOP and chief of staff to the mayor of Johns Creek.
Jason Binder, council member for Alpharetta.
First time for Councilman Binder here. Thank you.
Glad to be here.
Welcome.
It looks comfortable for a rookie.
Well, we're going to throw him right into the fire, and we're going to talk about why Gwinnett has rejected this transportation expansion. There was a lot of campaigning on both sides. I know Craig's earlier thoughts on the issue were who's going to put the money in, who's going to put the work in. I think we have a clearer picture about that now. One of my main takeaways from this is there was so much support both at the celebrity level and at the grassroots level of let's get a field campaign, at the financial level, at everything you could imagine for yes. And still, here we are with them only bringing out 46% of the vote.
I feel like it went downhill pretty quick, too.
You talking about an election night?
Leading up to the election.
No. You didn't sense any last week momentum?
No, the opposite.
Felt distancing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because usually grassroots campaigns, to find that anywhere you will, usually if they're going to get anywhere, it's usually that last week where you see that last minute push.
Mm-hmm.
So,
And well, let's just go ahead and get at the elephant in the room. It's a March referendum. We're sitting in March right here talking about one of the most important decisions a county can make. I don't see the benefit to having it at this time. I know that 2018 was on the table at least for a second, and now they're already looking at November 2020.
What was the rationale? What were the reasons given for having it in March instead of waiting until a normal cycle and holding it when the most possible people in Gwinnett will turn out to vote on it?
I heard the elected officials didn't want it on the same ballot as them. Is what
Well,
the
of course
reports
they-
I was.
Of
reading
course they
into.
didn't, but did they publicly say that? In other words,
Not-
did they give a reason that was
I
non-nefarious in nature?
I don't think they went into great depth on giving a reason. I know that
They just did it.
there was a lengthy. Well, there was a part of one of the lengthier AJC stories that said that both sides wanted the time to sell the issue. Both sides on that, especially the guys who were wanting to spend the money and were wanting to stir the grassroots.
Then why have it early?
No. Well, you can't fault them for having it too late and then turn around and start faulting them for having it too early.
I would hold that you can, because there are set times for this when you know people are going to show up. Even a municipal election in 19 in November would have been better. I mean, for perspective, we had 91,000.
I don't buy that.
We had 91,000 total votes
Why?
for this.
I think this referendum would brought out more voters than the average municipal election would have. Since I got a councilman sitting here, do you remember the turnout in your last election?
The last election was about
7%?
4,500.
Oh,
4,500 people.
What percentage of that is of Alpharetta? I should know that, but I don't.
Very.
Yeah, I mean, usually
Less than
10
10%.
to 12%. You got 17.
But you're still
we're less than that.
compounding it with something else, because right on this referendum, this was the only thing on.
So now
the
you're
ballot.
worried about the cost of the county? Is Is that why you're
No.
That's why you're saying you only wanted one thing on there?
Of course not. I'm worried about.
But I think that's the important thing right there. When was the last North Fulton vote for transit? Was that in primary time or
the
November?
T-SPLOST vote in November of 16. It was in a presidential year.
Yeah.
Not the one for expansion of when they were going to have the T-SPLOST for expansion to 400 for rail. I think that was a primary one.
The
right?
last T-SPLOST votes I remember was in November of 16.
Okay. So I think this is important to see that this was straight up on the transit plan. And it shows their strategy of what they've done. And I can only take on North Fulton the top-down strategy, the myopic view of all roads lead to Atlanta. We need to have extension there, and therefore that's what works. From a North Fulton point of view, they've done the surveys before. And arguably, I think a majority of people do want transit, but the transit plan they consistently provide is myopic towards Atlanta. So when you're outside of those main expressways, the transit doesn't really help too many people, and it showed in the vote.
Now, when you say they, who are you referring to?
Well, from my point of view was the MARTA before, and then the ATL Transit Board. Mm-hmm. We've asked for the regional transit. So they were supposed to do two things quickly, a logo and a regional transit plan. Congratulations on the logo. I'm still waiting on the regional transit plan. And that transit plan should have more of a bottoms-up approach of what transit needs are there. They do a very good job, and I understand that they have to have development opportunities. And you want that transit-oriented development for a good economy. But you also have to look at the transit needs, and it doesn't match up to the commuter maps of what we have. More people are going east-west and staying within North Fulton than they are going to Atlanta. And I'm sure it's probably it felt very similar for Gwinnett.
But didn't the Gwinnett plan provide for some more flexibility of what they wanted to do with their expansion? That I think a lot of advocates in Gwinnett were saying, listen, we can expand it now, or we can expand it in 15 years. And the deal we have now gives us some flexibility on, like you were saying, the east-west lines, which I know North Fulton has always looked at too. So it was looking to me that while the perception, I guess, from the no side was we're just going to send all this money to MARTA, they're going to just extend the gold line, and that's all we get. I don't know if that was actually the case.
Well, it did, and I don't disagree with anything you said, Jason. And I'll just touch on it. Maybe I'm going to get myself in a little bit of trouble here, but
I figured that's what this whole podcast is
exactly.
for.
Well, you own this thing. How can you get in some trouble?
Hans gets in trouble.
So,
yeah.
And I mentioned earlier that the public perception of this vote seemed to go downhill pretty quickly. The public perception that I saw on social media was not some of the things that you mentioned that seemed to be logical things that rational people can debate. The public perception I saw on social media was no more, we don't want more crime. We don't, MARTA has not been able to prove an ROI in Fulton County. What makes people in, Gwinnett County think that they're going to see anything different? And then there was something about a robocall, I think, that went out about real high density apartments.
A robocall went out from one of the no advocates saying MARTA has planned to put thousands of apartments in Gwinnett should the referendum pass. That's not good for Gwinnett. I have no idea where that really
and my point being that, that it muddies the water. It's not good for anybody to, come from that place when, no matter what side of the argument you're on, it's a conversation we have to have.
I would agree. And it's tricky with the social media. And I hear you. There's a lot of noise out there. And then when you look in social media and say, is that what the public or the voters as a whole are saying?
Right.
I really don't know. And you're right. There were some unfortunate things too. I think one thing that was concerning and kind of showed what I've seen from my experience is they talk about all these groups that were for it, but you didn't see any of the elected officials. You didn't see any resolutions in support. You didn't see any of the nonprofits that have transit needs backing it. And then I believe the transit plan that they had, it looked like they were adding to it, kind of like what they did in the last T-SPLOST. Oh, we better take down the toll booths, adding to it to make people appreciate it more. But there wasn't really saying that we're going to be able to do all of it. This is on our wish list, and then we're going to prioritize once we get the money.
Two comments. The thing about the apartments, I mean, that's local politics 101 now. I don't care what the issue is. If you're going to have a zoning issue, it's going to open up an ice cream shop. Somebody's going to send out a robocall and email saying it's coming into it's going to bring apartments. I mean,
Doesn't make it right.
No, it doesn't. Not at all. But it should be something that's anticipated, especially on something that mass transit. I mean, I hate those things. Every time we try to do something in Johns Creek, somebody comes out saying we're trying to build apartments, which is categorically a lie. And even if there are apartments there, they're apartments that cost more than $2,000 a month, and
Right.
the people that they're worried about aren't going to be able to live in those apartments. So that's another side of it. But I'm surprised that you thought that. Again, I mean, I don't live in Gwinnett. I wasn't on the ground. I had the opposite impression on the last week, was that there was momentum. Maybe not momentum to victory, but momentum and energy building on the pro side in the last week. And one of the AJC articles I read was that the pro sides were saying we started too late. Mm-hmm. You know, if we had started an earlier month, spending the money, getting the people on the sidewalks, the walking around money, and I don't mean that in a negative term, that they didn't start early enough, which was kind of what was my point weeks ago when we had the other roundtable and I was doing this, I was making the money sign. You got to be spending the money now. If you wait till a week out, you're casting your doom here.
And I think the momentum felt that way to maybe some of us, or I guess me in particular, are not living in Gwinnett, because you have Stacey Abrams comes out in support, Nathan Deal comes out in support, like a sheriff in Gwinnett comes out in support. You have all of these people falling in line, and I'm like, okay, this thing is moving. We've got people on the ground. They've got these huge political consultant names fighting for it, and then just nothing.
Well, I mean, I don't want to take away from the councilman's time here. So, but I mean, you know, if the issue was a bond for more jails, then the sheriff coming out and supporting it's going to carry some weight. If it's an issue about passing a law to increase the sentence for rape, then Danny Porter coming out in favor means something. I never got the connection that the DA coming out in favor of a mass transit is going to mean anything.
That's a good point.
And no one's more respected in Gwinnett County than Danny Porter, but that would be like my mayor coming out for a change of a law in the Atlanta City Council. It's like,
But what about the support from the business community?
But
Doesn't that matter?
But again, that's similar to what we saw at T-Splosh for North Fulton when it failed. All the business community was for it. You got all the celebrity endorsements. Those endorsers, they don't knock on doors. They don't gather the community to really sell the product.
It's seed money, and again, it's not to cut you off. I'm sorry.
No, you're good.
It's not 1954. The fact that the local businesses come out for something isn't going to sway a vote. It's just seed money for you to use other tactics.
Sure. I mean, I don't think there is a doubt to people that look at elections and look at data that if this had been on the 2018 ballot, it would have passed. I think everybody is pretty unanimously saying that because of the way turnout looked in the fall of 2018. This probably will be on the fall 2020 ballot. I think a lot of indicators are pointing that way.
You think so?
I think so. We had 91,000 total votes, which for an individual referendum for Gwinnett County, it's not terrible, I suppose.
More than who came out in the 2016 party primaries, if we're putting this in perspective here.
Sure. Yeah, it's around like 17 or 20%.
But less than the 300K who showed up in the Abrams-Kemp race.
315, yeah.
At some point, though, what does that say to the voters? That'll be the fourth time they've put it on the ballot since 1990?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, fourth time since 1970. It was a 70, a 90, 02.
1971 and 1990 were the two rejections.
There wasn't one in the aughts? There wasn't one in the 00s?
No.
Oh, okay.
I don't know. So if I'm a voter in Gwinnett County and I have voted against this 3 times, I probably start to get pretty tired of the powers that be continuing to try and ram it down my throat.
Yeah, yeah.
But this will be something that they will be forced into, and maybe not by 2020 because we're looking pretty short term. But eventually, you get to a point where you're saying we don't have a choice now. We have to take whatever deal is about to be in front of us because it will get that bad. The population surge is just out of control.
But what forces that breaking point? I mean, you're right. I think when it will reach that point where it's just 100% gridlock, no movement, but something has to occur to break that point. They're going to have to bring the referendum back up again. I mean, Kemp can't sign a bill and says, okay, now there's a MARTA line going to Buford. Or Nash can't.
I thought businesses...
There's a lawyer somewhere probably trying to look it up, but I don't think so.
So Mike Kennedy, who is a regular panelist on our show, Preston, forgive me if I'm going in a different direction here, but he suggested on his Twitter account that it's time for the state to take over transportation projects like that.
Isn't that what the ATL is? To
No.
a degree.
No.
No. The ATL is just a formation tool, but it still has the
reallocation.
same. I think it still has the same ownership principles at its core.
I think that's what's interesting with the 511 bill coming up and seeing how much leeway, if this doesn't make it through, which I think they got to work out some things, then what will it mean for the future years? Because it's probably going to take a statewide initiative to get it to Gwinnett.
To do it soon, I think that's actually possible. Yeah, if they want to get it in the next 5 years, it might take a statewide.
Well, they got the
push.
right legislators.
Yeah, the right anti-local control.
The anti-local control.
We'll get there. We'll get there.
Craig is shaking his head.
No, I just I'm actually surprised that the Democrat in the room is the one not saying that you're not going to get this on the November 20 ballot. Just the quotes the quotes that I was hearing from Charlotte Nash to the head of the Gwinnett Democratic Party made it sound like that they were going to get this back on November 20 ballot.
You say a lot of stuff the day of defeat.
You do? No, touche.
Are you looking at me saying it's not going to be on the 2020?
I thought that's what you said a
No,
minute
I
ago,
said
that you
it-
didn't think it would be.
I said it would be.
Oh, I apologize. I
No, that's
misunderstood.
okay.
I thought
I thought he backed and said, well, maybe we would.
We took another 15 seconds to reinforce it, so
Okay.
I'm glad
I
we
got
did.
it. No, I mean everything from the charge of voter suppression to Nash on the radio saying, "Well, we got 2 Democrats now, and they'll vote to put this on the ballot." I see it as foregone conclusion they'll jam it back on the November ballot.
Why would you not want to put something like this on a ballot where the most amount of people could vote on it? No, just to make it. I mean, if you just know a March referendum brings out this many people,
Is that
and
a
November
rhetorical
election,
question, Preston?
It is a rhetorical
Thank
question,
you.
but I don't understand the logic behind. Well, we need to make sure this is by itself so that a smaller base makes their voice heard. I don't see it, and I don't know if anyone at this table really sees it either. I'm just kind of putting it out into the ether of a March referendum.
You know
doesn't
what?
make any sense to me.
I'm not going to comment on that.
I think that goes down. I think that sort of thinking goes down a very dangerous, slippery slope. I think that some of the terms that had been thrown around since Tuesday and since before Tuesday, by the Democratic Party at different levels in the state, I think it's a very dangerous concept because some of the terms and some of the context that they were using, they were really getting very close to the idea of disenfranchising elections. Not disenfranchising, discrediting certain elections.
What are you suggesting is very dangerous?
The idea that
More people voting?
No, the idea that calling this, I mean, the chairwoman of the Gwinnett Democratic Party, I forget her name, I apologize. She said, quote, in the AJC, that this was a textbook case of voter suppression, unquote. I do not think that the timing of an election constitutes a suppression. And I think using the term suppression is a very dangerous term because you're getting very close to claiming that any election that is not on a November ballot is by its definition, or even a presidential ballot, which is kind of what they're inferring, is a very dangerously close step to discrediting any election, which would include a special election, a municipal election, anything that doesn't occur in November.
Well,
that's dangerous, and party primaries as well.
Let me ask you, because I think I hope we'll end up agreeing on this, but I would say it's closer to when lawmakers get accused of this is legislators choosing their voters in a case of gerrymandering. I would call this closer to that. I don't think they were suppressing the vote. I think they looked at the data they had in front of them and said, at this date we can expect this turnout, and at this date we can expect this turnout, and they picked one.
I thought you said both sides were pretty happy with the date.
I had mentioned that there was an AJC story that said both sides wanted the time to sell the issue. Whether that's true or not, I don't know.
Call it whatever you want, Craig, but if the intention of having it in March was to minimize the number of people that came out to vote, isn't that voter suppression?
No, I don't think it's suppression. Suppression is an overt act to stop somebody
What would you call
from
it
voting.
then? If
Nobody is stopping anybody from voting if an election's in March. Saying voter suppression is an overt act to impede a human being from voting.
What would you call it then? If you have two choices, one to have it in March and one to have it in a regular cycle, and you choose the one in March with the intention of having less people turn out.
I don't think you can prove intention. If you wanted to go down that road, you could call it a strategy. You could call it an intent, but it is not a suppression. That is a dangerous word. And especially in a state like Georgia, that is a remarkably dangerous word.
I think I have to agree with Craig here that I think there have been in this state instances of voter suppression. I think this is a different case, although similarly consequential, of picking the electorate you want. And you can pick the electorate you want through voter suppression, or you can pick it by who you think is more likely to turn out when. And I think this is maybe a case of that.
You can call it whatever you want, but
I just think this is, I'll see this through purely partisan lens, and I apologize for maybe being too partisan on it.
No, that's
I
why we
think
have
that,
you.
I think this is the Democrats failing at their job to get out their vote, and now they're blaming Republicans for it.
couldn't both things be true though? Couldn't the Democrats have failed at their job and the Republicans purposefully have put it in March?
Have
instead of
made
a
the job
November
very
election?
hard. Yeah.
I have no doubt that that was part of the thinking of it.
All right.
But again, I don't consider that suppression. And again, if the Democratic Party, which made it abundantly clear, both in Gwinnett and at the state level, wanted this vote, then they should have gotten their people out and they should stop complaining about what somebody else did to constitute their loss.
I don't remember them complaining that it was in March, and I know the strategies in other counties were having it in March, so it makes sense now that they lost. It's like, oh well, we had we pulled a bad date.
Hindsight's 20/20.
But
we had Fred Hicks on though, and he was very active in the pro camp. I feel like I remember him having some things to say
About the
about
date.
it being in March.
And I think
About
that's
it being
true. I
early.
think maybe the people who were in charge of the decision didn't have much to say about when the date they picked was. But I think, advocates and part of that team that went on to advocate for it were wondering, I guess.
I personally would like to see it in the November ballot, just because I think there's a good chance it would lose again under the top-down strategy that they have.
And that would be fine with me.
Yeah,
Because if you get the
that's-
maximum voter base and then it loses, I go, okay, Gwinnett County doesn't want this.
Well,
when I
no,
see this,
but-
I say, oh, the people who were motivated to go out in March don't want this.
I kind of disagree with that. I think under surveys they say most people do want transit. I don't think most people want the transit they're selling,
Oh, that's okay, sure.
and that's what I think it truly is.
I mean, that's a great argument. And we pulled up the map. I know this is a podcast, so we can't see it. But
Sure.
George Chidi, he's a Democratic comedy. He's on Georgia Poll and Peach
Yeah.
Pundit.
Yeah.
He made an excellent point. If we could pan down a little bit closer to Snellville, the African American community down.
Talking to the mic,
I'm
Craig.
sorry, the African American community down in the Snellville area. I don't know if this was anecdotal, if there was polling to prove this, was just as equally opposed to MARTA down there because of what Mr. Appen here has said. There was no return on investment. They didn't see the benefit to themselves. So it's not a racial thing. It's not a partisan thing, even though the Democratic Party wanted to make it a partisan thing, and they did. That there is an ROI geography issue here. I mean, you can see from the green versus the red the geography of it. There's no surprise. I'm actually the only surprise that I see is exactly what George pointed out. I would have thought the Snellville vote would have come in yay, because of the demographic changes. But apparently, the geography trumped the demographics and the party. I mean, you expected the green up the I-85 corridor. That's not a surprise. You expected Peachtree Corners. You expected Buford. You expected Loganville. But that might have been the swing area right there. And I don't know if George is listening to this, but I mean, that was a wonderful commentary that he wrote on that, and I think it was dead on.
I think it is interesting because there are some variants I didn't expect in there, because I expected the areas closer to the 85 corridor, closer to the 285 in general, to go a little more green, and yet that is an outlier that I find interesting. I think there was certainly a racial connotation to the misinformation that was going around. I don't think either campaign went to try and go make this, hey, let's basically vote on race gentrification, but there was a lot of misinformation of, hey, we're going to fill your streets with these kinds of people, and that's
think-
always a question that
And
comes
so-
up during
well,
this expansion.
And I do think that happened on both sides. You had
Oh, sure.
you had ATL Transit Board members talking about parochial views, and that people were afraid, and then using decades-old arguments.
Oh yeah,
So
it was out there, and
it was
unfortunately,
both sides.
both sides, and unfortunately, I'll admit it. It comes from the Republican side, the hard right, if you will. They use that terminology. They throw it around like it's nothing, and it's despicable the way that they do it. And Joe Newton, who apparently became a MARTA expert because he runs a Facebook page. The AJC keeps going back to this guy.
I do
is
see
an
his name
absolute
everywhere.
loon. I mean, he's been kicked out of more GOP meetings than I can count. So, I really wish the AJC would screen these guys before he declared them
to
the
bring
expert
it
on
to
an
bring it
issue.
to bring it full circle. I actually think he was referenced in one of the articles I was reading because he was part of the funding behind this robocall that we mentioned earlier. So
Oh, I don't doubt it one bit. I
Sure.
have no
Yeah.
independent knowledge of that, but I don't doubt it one bit.
sure. Okay. Let's move on. Other transportation issue that has come up this week I find incredibly interesting. The jet fuel tax break complete story. Now, if my panelists don't mind, I'm going to talk for a little bit here to try and clue everybody in. But while Craig finishes filling out his bracket that he's just showed us.
It is Friday, by the way.
I'm
As
catching
in,
up.
half the games have already been played at this point. So, a tax break on jet fuel for not just Delta, although that's the major airport we have in this state, was put on in the mid 2000s, back during the time when Delta was either approaching or in the middle of their big trouble, their big economic trouble. I guess they're declared bankruptcy. I was pretty young when that
Who
happened.
has?
Delta. But I believe that declared bankruptcy in the early 2000s. So whether it was declared or not, they were in real trouble. So the jet fuel tax
all
break
the
was put
airlines
on.
were.
Yeah,
Yeah, they
certainly.
were.
Certainly. The issue got brought back up during the Republican primary for governor when Casey Cagle, in a response to Delta breaking off a marketing tie with the NRA, put that tax break in jeopardy. You can say threatened, you can say he held it against them. He put it into the conversation of why are we giving this company who doesn't support the NRA a jet fuel tax break. By the way, that discount was used a whopping 18 times in its entire lifetime, but we can come back to that later.
By one person or
The same person 18
same
times?
person?
That's a good point. I don't have that number in front of me.
Touche.
He did succeed in the tax break extension getting held up, but when the House went back in for the special session, they put it back in. And again, they have put an extension on it this year with a smaller, I believe it's called an excise tax on it, that would help fund other rural airports in the state. So it doesn't just go to the major players. All is well and good at this point in our story. There are about 25 no votes on that tax bill, by the way, as it goes through the House. Now in the Senate, that is dealing with a bill that would require a state takeover of the airport. They have tied these two issues together and essentially linked, Delta, do you want your jet fuel tax break? Well, then you have got to let the Georgia, whatever authority is about to be established, airport authority, I guess, take over Hartsfield-Jackson. The claims that are coming from legislators include the words like holding Delta hostage. It is really something to watch. I know Delta is not at this point backing off. This is not something that the new bill is afraid to exaggerate with. The Senate Finance Committee hiked up the excise tax rate to $120 million from, I think, $4 million, and what they would be charged to help rural airports in the state and all other airports in the state. The legislation that the Senate has proposed would create the highest fuel tax in the entire country among states that have a hub airport, which I believe is like 25 states. There is probably no chance this has to pass in the House, but these two issues are now being tied together, and it's created a new way to look at the same issue that we seem to keep coming back to, which is the states want to take over the Atlanta airport. Okay,
I
I'm
want
done.
Craig to go
I'm done
first.
with my narrative. Yeah, Craig, thoughts?
I'm not going to comment on the righteousness of the act. I just think my first reaction when I read this, my first reaction was, this is why people shouldn't pay attention to how bills are made. This is the old
This is
adage
a
about the
very-
sausage.
yeah,
You don't
this is a
see
very-
the sausage. You don't want to see this. And let me make sure I get this right. So the Senate passed. So the jet fuel bill passed the House, went to the Senate. The Senate added the takeover element to the bill to the tax bill. So the Senate passed,
and then changed most of the tax elements.
So this is I find that beautiful. This is legislating at its perfection here. And I'm not saying that this is good or bad, but this is why people just need to understand how legislating occurs. The Senate passed a bill and then took another bill and then passed that same first bill back onto the second bill. So now there are two bills on it. I mean, that's just beautiful. Whoever came up with that is a genius. But yeah, this is why people shouldn't pay attention to this.
Genius is a flexible term as you use it.
Yes, it is.
A lot of people would call it genius in the same way that Darth Vader is a genius. I mean,
it just shows how things can change rapidly. And it reminded me when I worked down there, the Senate and the House on so many issues have such different perspectives on it. They all represent the same people, yet somehow the body in which you sit in changes your perspective on what you think should be non-malleable. Mm-hmm. I find that from a poli-sci standpoint just fascinating.
Well, and I don't want to say that any of what I'm about to say infers some sort of nefarious intent, but I do find it, if you're curious about how much of a chance this has to pass in the House if it does come out of the Senate, House Speaker David Ralston has a son who was on Delta's team of lobbyists. So if you were thinking it's zero chance, it's actually less than zero chance somehow. So it is one body acting completely independently of another for all that we can tell.
So I'll just say that I think this is interesting. This has come back from the dead after the Stacey Abrams, Brian Kemp, and Casey Cagle election. In that, I think after all that came out, that we did see a lot of backlash across the country. I don't think it put Georgia in a very good light. I think a lot of businesses that might look to establish some sort of corporate headquarters here flagged that as something to consider in the future. And I think it's playing with fire when you are holding a gun to the head of the largest private employer in the state of Georgia with something like this. I don't get the politics of it.
It's really holding two guns to their head. You're holding the state takeover and now the jet fuel tax, and they're attached to each other now.
Right. And it's something that I would think a governor who is concerned with protecting the reputation of the Georgia business community would put a stop to pretty quick.
And I think you'll see that in the sense that this is where having an active governor, having a governor, a pro-business governor can step in. I'm a big fan of Nathan Deal. I wasn't at the beginning. I was a Karen Handel person, and et cetera. But Nathan Deal really grew on me over the 8 years, and one of that was his protection of business. He saw the big picture. Right. And I think Brian Kemp will, and I was a Casey Cagle guy, I think Brian Kemp will see the big picture. He has the experience, he has the background that he can see that. And, people grow into the office. Some people don't need to grow into the office. Some people do. I think Kemp probably needs a little bit, but I think he recognizes what his predecessor has done. And he recognizes how beloved his predecessor is in so many areas and say this could be a pathway to that. It buys him credibility among a lot of sections that he may not have had after the November election.
Well, and helps him try to repair that relationship with the city of Atlanta, too, while the Senate is also trying to take, their prettiest penny.
I don't know. Well, I don't know.
What are...
the corruption thing, yeah, you want to have a relationship, but, you don't want to put your arm around a guy on an issue that might really, on that particular angle, might really get bit on.
All right, so maybe one of you all can fill me in. Bottom line, what are Senate Republicans trying to accomplish with all this noise about state takeover of the airport? Because do they legitimately think that the state is better served to take it over? Is that
from arguments I've heard?
I think they do, because I think that they see the Georgia Port Authority as such a wonderfully run administration or entity, and I think they believe that the airport is just as critical to Georgia as the Port Authority is. And I think that they believe there just seems to be something counterintuitive that such a valuable entity is run by a city instead of by the entire state. Maybe the analogy may be poor since
No,
I'm not an expert,
based
but,
on what?
but if Savannah ran the Port Authority as opposed to the state, I think the state would have just the same question about why is the city running the second largest port along the eastern seaboard.
That is the argument I hear, and it's
I
actually
mentioned
pretty
that just
good.
not to try to make it seem like an anti-Atlanta or even a racial thing. I mean, this is Georgia. Everything's got to become a freaking racial thing. But I think it was Savannah would be the same thing if everything was flipped.
That's actually, besides the weird racial epitaph, I think that's actually a pretty good articulation of the argument that I hear from a lot of the senators, Republican senators that are looking at this bill.
Do you think by the Senate putting those two bills together, they knew it wasn't going to pass, so it's their way of just shooting
sure.
the flare, and that's
sure.
all it is for this year only.
It gives them more weight in the conference committee process.
Exactly. So I think that's all it was. Is just posturing.
And that's kind of why I ask, like, what is the end game here?
Well, and this is what Craig was talking about, is that I don't think that posturing is incredibly uncommon. But you had eyes on this issue. You had eyes on both these issues for different reasons, and then you link the two of them together and then decide to stake this on it. You were seeing how the sausage gets made, and it's ugly. It's not good.
And if it bombs, the only thing it accomplishes is that it pisses off the largest employer in the state of Georgia.
That's
Period.
where the governor gets into the play. That's where and it's a difficult job, but he signed up for it.
Well,
that's where he.
But how
smooths.
far down that road is he going to let it go?
Well, Governor
very good
Deal
question.
Governor Deal put this tax back in place temporarily after the legislature didn't move on it, like we talked about maybe 2 years ago. I don't think you could put that back in place permanently. That's not out of the realm of possibility, though. I still think this doesn't even have a chance to get to his desk in its current form. It also, by the way, just because I like to mention these things, doesn't have a fiscal note at this point, so we have no idea how much this would cost or what the financial implications are of anything like this. I want to ask a question on a different angle, though, because I have a feeling if this ever does come up to the floor for a vote, this is what the argument could look like. Is Craig actually mentioned this, I think, a couple weeks ago. The Democratic Party is starting to take a turn towards what do these tax breaks against businesses buy us and buy our community. We saw this in New York with Amazon. We saw this a lot of places with Amazon in particular. Delta saves around $40 million a year on this jet fuel tax break. Do you think there's a possibility that the progressives of Georgia, however many there are, could buy into the argument of why are we giving them this $40 million tax break? Maybe this is worth taking another look at, and maybe these new hikes on it would be worth it if they helped expand things around the state.
You mentioned where it would be if we took away the tax break. We'd be amongst the highest. Where are we now with the tax break?
That's a good question. Amongst states that have major airports, I believe we are not the top, but we're competitive. I think it's like the top 5. I looked at it, but I don't want to say anything because I don't like being wrong, even though I am most of the time. But I don't know. I would say we're competitive, but I do not remember us being, we have an absurdly lower rate than everybody else in the
So I
country.
think that's a good place to be.
Mm-hmm.
Can I take a stab at
Yes, I'm asking Hans because
So-
Hans is very familiar with this
Sure.
movement. Yeah.
Well, so I guess I'll preface it with I have no idea, but here's one thing to consider. Like I mentioned, this was a national story during the governor's race. And frankly, I think, outside of Republicans in the state of Georgia, I think the rest of the country looked at this issue as what are they doing down there in Georgia with messing around with their largest private employer? And I don't know, if I'm a Democrat in the state legislature, what's the saying? You never
look a gimp horse in the mouth. Is that what
Bite
you're
the
trying to say?
Bite the hand that feeds you?
no,
Yeah.
never stop your enemy.
Don't attack your enemy when he's imploding. Right?
Yeah, shooting himself
when
in
they're,
the foot.
when they're
whatever.
retreating.
Right,
Don't attack when they're retreating.
Right.
The Napoleon thing. Yeah.
Right. So, you could have a point, Preston. It could be something that they could and maybe should use as leverage for a different political battle. But, I would be, I would consider letting that be if I were in the state legislature, and we're looking at a 2020 race where, like we've said on this show before, Donald Trump is on the ticket. We saw a blue wave in 2018. Suburban women and women across the state in particular were voting Democrat that had never voted Democrat before, and this would be one more issue that would be, quote unquote, I'm using my air quotes, on the ticket in 2020 if they just let it be.
I think this would be the argument that could try and pitch support for this plan. I agree with you. I don't think it has a lot of legs.
I'm sorry, were you saying that you think that this local Georgia Delta issue could affect the presidential race?
No, I'm saying that it could affect turnout for Democrats in the state in 2020.
Okay.
I think that's a good closer. All right.
Hey, I have one clarification, Preston.
Yes.
So I was fumbling through my quote. Craig, you were right. It was Napoleon. And the quote was, "Never interfere with an enemy while he's in the process of destroying himself." So
That might as well be the motto of this show.
is it a show title?
Yeah. Every time Craig gets the mic, we should all just kind of step
And
out of the
ironically,
room.
the most famous example of that was Napoleon retreating out of Russia. So there's a little
We can always
historical
yeah, we can
irony
always
there.
count on Craig for the historical view, especially
Yep.
since he was
I
there.
just watched Waterloo again about a week ago, so I'm all over it. Let's get some Wellington in here.
What's Waterloo?
The movie Waterloo. It's a movie. I figured you knew the battle, but not the movie.
Who's Ted Kennedy? All right. That's going to do it for us this week. This has been the Georgia Politics Podcast. For all of our co-hosts, thank you for listening in. We have a voicemail number where you can call in and leave a message. Daniel's going to pull it up for me right now so I can give it to you right before we sign off. But thank you to all of my hosts for joining me. We will talk to everybody next week. And that number is 770-376-7403. Thanks, everybody, for listening. We'll talk to you next week.